Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Friday, July 11th. Our first podcast in quite a while. Not a lot has gone on in Hoosier Nation the last month and a half, but various things have gone on, and to help us make sense of some of those things, to talk about it, Zach Osterman, our good friend of the Indianapolis Star, is back on a podcast on the Brink. Zach, how are you doing on this beautiful Friday afternoon in July?
I panicked when I realized the mute button was a little bit different. I thought I wasn't going to find it in time. It's 87 degrees outside. When we're done here, I got to go cut my grass. So I'm guessing this is going to be a much more enjoyable experience than what comes after it.
Yeah, there's really no good time of day at this point of the year to cut the grass. I figured that out the other morning. Went out around 7:45. Thought I could beat the heat a little bit. Neighbors maybe didn't like it, but I was trying to beat the heat, and it was 9:30 when I was done, and it was already steamy and humid out there. So no good time. Definitely been a hot summer. But Zach, there's been a lot obviously with IU basketball it's been a busy off season, but since we were last had an episode, obviously Indiana picks up a commitment from Alexa Restic, which the Serbian guard. They've got a commitment now from 2026 guard Prince Alexander Moody. But I wanted to start with just the roster for next season. Right now, Indiana at 12 players, and my understanding is Anthony Leal going to be moving on. Obviously, his waiver situation was a bit of a long shot to begin with, but still seems like Luke Goody's floating around out there as a potential addition to next season's roster. But as the later we get into summer with Indiana's tour, our trip to Puerto Rico, less than a month away now, what have you heard? Where do things stand with Goody? Is there any update? Have you heard anything? Do you feel like there's a time frame where we may know something in terms of his status for next season?
No, I mean, to be honest, I'm surprised that we've gotten this deep into the summer and not heard anything. And I know that, Darren DeVries kind of pointed out when we all huddled with him at Huber that there are a lot more of these requests this year. And it's worth pointing out, too, there's quite a lot of turnover at the NCAA right now as we kind of phase in a lot of these new structures around the NIL clearinghouse. And you're seeing a lot of sort of longtime administrators stepping back and retiring. Maybe a la what we've seen with some college coaches, frankly, in the last few years. That said, I mean, for it to be July 11th and a player who I think, there were a lot of players that kind of put in these waivers just basically seeing if, they could get them because the NCAA just didn't have an appetite to tell anyone no. I think Goody's in a different case because I think there is at least an argument that he should get the year back. I mean, I understand the rules are written the way they are. I think you can argue, especially in the modern context, that those rules are probably a little bit arbitrary. And what specifically is holding Goody back from getting sort of just automatically getting one of his years back is kind of arbitrary. And so for it to be July 11th and him to still be waiting for an answer is surprising to me. I don't know, I don't know if that, I don't know if any timetable has been communicated privately. I will say in general, schools have always kind of treated these the best practice in these cases to not comment, to not sort of make a public show of it, to try and be respectful of the process for fear of maybe influencing the NCAA to rule against them. But I think I think we can all kind of put two and two together with Anthony Leal. I mean, he's sort of offering to sell some of his IU gear on social media and things like that. I don't think we need some sort of formal confirmation that Leal has decided just to move on. But it does surprise me, not necessarily the quiet around Goody doesn't surprise me. Again, I think that is generally taken as best practice in these situations. But to be this deep into the summer and a player who I think has a distinct case for an extra year of eligibility, still be waiting for an answer one way or the other. that surprises me, and that, I guess to what extent I will insert my personal opinion. I'm not sure it sits very well with me, but not that anybody at the NCAA cares very much what I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the good thing for Goody and for Indiana, at least at this point, from my understanding. You may have heard different, but my understanding is that he can continue to work with the team this summer. There's nothing preventing that from happening, so it's not like any grounds being missed or unaccounted for. But for him, obviously, having things in a bit of limbo. I mean, if he is going to be moving on after this season, has basketball aspirations, I assume he would want to be able to figure that situation out sooner rather than later if he's going to go overseas or try to latch on to a G League roster next season. Not sure exactly what he plans to do beyond basketball, but beyond that, I mean, I think from a planning perspective, when the coaches are putting together the roster for next season, it would be nice to know at least before the Puerto Rico trip what the roster is going to look like. If there's maybe a need to go out and get another player. I know we get late as we get later into the summer, the likelihood of that happening diminishes. So that's a situation where I kind of agree with you. I did understand initially why maybe the timetable for this was taking a little bit longer with the volume of waivers, but we're getting into later in the summer now, really, and to have this kind of an outstanding issue, particularly if he's going to be denied and wants to do an appeal, it seems like this could drag on for a while. The other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, because you've done a fair amount of reporting on this. You've covered it extensively. Quite frankly, I've leaned on you as a resource at times due to my lack of understanding on this topic. But the House settlement now in effect, we know that there's been a lot of changes in terms of revenue sharing in the sport and the NIL deals. Just big picture. I know you talked to Scott Dolson about how Indiana is going to handle its revenue sharing. Can you give us kind of a brief overview of how that's going to work from an Indiana perspective, the revenue sharing piece, and then what you've heard maybe so far in terms of how NIL has been impacted? I saw some reporting earlier this week from various places in terms of the new, I guess, process for getting these NIL deals approved. It doesn't seem like things are maybe being rubber stamped and just pushed through. And so there's maybe going to be some pushback on some of these deals and having to verify certain things before they do before they do get pushed through. I know kind of a loaded question there, but can you just maybe speak to this new system, how Indiana is going to handle it, and kind of what you've heard so far in terms of how things are going on that front?
Yeah, so it's important to kind of preface this because I know a lot of people know this, but I also think, at least anecdotally, I think a lot of people don't. NIL and revenue sharing are still two separate things, but they are now sort of governed under the same umbrella in a way that NIL, initially kind of started as this entity completely unto itself, and then it was kind of slowly brought closer and closer to the schools and the conferences. What's happened now is the House settlement, as you said, is in effect, and that means revenue sharing has begun. Athletes, who knows how that stuff's structured? Like Indiana pays monthly. Like I just know this because my wife works at IU. I don't know if these kids are getting monthly paychecks. I don't know if they're getting 50,000 now and 50,000 at the end of the season or whatever. That stuff can be negotiated, but the rev share split for year one. And when I talked to Scott Dolson about this, Indiana obviously researched this and kind of tried to figure out a best practice with it. I think it's probably fair to say Indiana was about as straightforward as it could be in terms of its rev share approach in year one. I think they kept it pretty simple. They followed a lot of industry standards. All the money is just going into straight revenue sharing, no extra scholarships, no Alston payments. It's all just direct payment to athletes. Football, Dolson wouldn't kind of share exact numbers, and it's worth saying like those numbers kind of drift a little bit because you may not, for example, if you're Kurt Signetti, you may not spend all your money because you might want a little bit of a reserve somewhere. Like if you come out of spring practice and you have a couple needs you didn't expect, you don't want to have no rev share money because then you can't go get players that are going to help you fill those holes. So it's down to the dollars and cents, just like payrolls in baseball or basketball or something like that. It's never going to be like an exact thing. Football at Indiana is, I think, going to come up just shy of about 75% of the revenue bucket, which is over $15 million. It's a little under 15 and a half. I think it's like 15.3 something, 0.34 or something like that. 75 is widely seen as kind of the industry standard for football. I think a few schools will do more, probably not a ton more. Obviously, there's just not a lot of room beyond. If you're going all the way to 75%, there's only another 25% you can throw in there. But that's and that's one of those where the Big Ten didn't tell anybody that that this is what you have to do. You have to meet this certain number. But I do think there was probably some guidance in terms of saying, hey, listen, football is the breadwinner here, and we need to feed football. Football needs to be, kind of consistent across the board as much as possible in a conference where it is so directly tied to such large, annual revenue numbers. And I think also probably for just competitive purposes, the idea that you're not going to have like these wild gaps between what what an Ohio State's putting into football, what a Purdue's putting into football, et cetera. Basketball is going to be close to 20%, which per my understanding is kind of the high end of the range. The range I heard from a couple different places at football schools was 15 to 20%, with the presumption that more schools would be more like 15 to 17, 15 to 18, and it would be the schools that would emphasize basketball a little bit more that would go to 20.
To be clear, men, you're talking just
men's basketball, yes,
okay,
men's basketball. Thank you. There are going to be some Big East schools that go north of that number, perhaps well north of it, because while they don't have the overall revenues anywhere near the overall revenues a Big Ten school, for example, would have, or an SEC school, they don't have football to feed. So, UConn, Marquette, Villanova, probably Georgetown, those places. Yeah, those places are probably going to have, not everybody. Like I don't know if I don't know if Seton Hall is going to be able to go crazy with it, or Butler or somebody like that. But some of those Big East schools are going to have more money than probably any Big Ten or SEC school in men's basketball, simply because they don't have to feed football. The next two sports, in terms of percentages, will be women's basketball and volleyball. Those are kind of your next two highest revenue sports, if you think about it, in terms of just like how much money you're making off of them annually. And then everything else would be the word that Scott used to me was sort of sprinkled across the rest of his athletics programs. I thought Mike Bobinski said something really interesting to Nathan Baird, where he said basically there would be a reserved fund of a few $100,000 that would not be specific to any one sport, but would be for the recruiting and retention of elite athletes. So, if Purdue has a chance to get an Olympic diver, which of course they've had, some very successful divers in the recent past, you go to that fund rather than swim dive having, just like a consistent number all the time. I wouldn't be shocked if Indiana did something like that. And so that's how they'll break it up in year one. They're already starting projections for year two, but I think there's going to be a lot of learn along the way. I think probably one of the biggest lessons that everyone took from NIL that we're going to see overlaid onto revenue sharing is that, whatever we think is best practice here in months 1 through 8 is going to seem so outdated by the time we get to like month 18 or month 24. And there's going to be a lot of evolving sort of thinking on how to marshal all this. Never mind the fact that some of the spending could evolve. I think there are people who believe, for example, that we might eventually get to a place where schools are released to add scholarships without that money counting against your revenue sharing cap, at which point I think a school like Indiana might at least have some interest in adding scholarships in a sport like baseball or men's soccer or softball or, men's and women's swimming and diving, where there's probably not going to be a lot of money running around those sports either way, except at a very small handful of schools, but where the currency is probably going to be more scholarship opportunities. And there are some folks in college athletics who wonder if, right now, if you want to add scholarships, you have to take that money out of your revenue sharing pool. I have heard very sort of loosely that there are some people who think that maybe that restriction might get lifted and you might just be allowed to add scholarships and then the revenue sharing pool just stays where it is. And that might be, I think the reason for that is basically because a lot of these bigger schools are saying we need to be able to serve the non-revenue sports better in this revenue share era. And we'll see. We'll see if that happens. But, that's just kind of one example of like, don't marry yourself to any of this being, written in stone, because we're going to change the way that all this works. And one of the big things when you bring up the NIL clearinghouse, to kind of go to number two there, and that is now formally, as you said, under the roof of the NCAA, the NIL Go process with Deloitte, sort of scrutinizing or auditing every NIL deal over $600 and essentially coming back and saying either this reflects an athlete's fair market value and it's valid and it's approved, or it doesn't, and we're rejecting it and sending it back to the athlete in question to try and amend it to, fit our process. Like, no one knows really if that's going to stand up. I mean, I think almost since the conception of the idea of the clearinghouse, people have looked at it and thought it was ripe for legal challenge. Already you are seeing, as you mentioned, some complaints, some grievance being aired publicly over a lack of understanding of, basically what the auditing process is looking for and how to tailor these deals to satisfy their requirements. Sometimes there's probably some legitimate complaint there. There's probably some people that are just, politicking to raise noise. Then there are a lot of people that think that at some point someone will challenge legally the idea that the NCAA or any apparatus that it creates can tell an athlete what his or her fair market value is. And then we're back in court. The lawyers start the register going again, and we decide exactly how much we are going to be legally allowed to govern the NIL space. And I think the reason everybody's looking at that is because even at the big schools, a lot of athletics directors are looking at the money they've had to pour into NIL, which, has reached in some places $20 and $30 million annually in terms of like overall, like collective distribution. And then they're looking at this $20.5 million hole for revenue sharing, which is only going to keep expanding. The revenue share number is going to keep going up at a time when, for all but a select number of schools, television revenues are probably about to plateau, or at least certainly, we're getting to the point in the bell curve. I'm doing this, it's great radio with my hands. The point in the bell curve where we stop going up exponentially and things start to flatten out a little bit. And I say this every time I talk about revenue sharing, because everyone has forgotten the settlement part of the House settlement, that there is a $1 billion settlement that has to be backfilled for athletes. I think going back to like 2016, we're allowed to claim a portion of it. And it's going to be through media rights revenues that the NCAA and the member conferences pay for that primarily. And so, if you're Indiana, your Big Ten distributions aren't just going to keep spiking up and up and up here, because everybody's going to have to basically lose some of that money to the settlement, at least in the near term. So basically, listen, we can have a conversation about how college athletics allowed itself to get here. And that's a philosophical sort of discussion / blame game that we could do for, 2 hours, unto itself. But right here and now, athletics directors are, even at the most moneyed schools, are just saying we can't fund 20.5 million in rev share, 25 to 30 million in NIL, and keep everything else operating as normal. Nobody wants to cut sports. Nobody wants to sort of, pare back college athletics, but the NIL number can't just keep climbing indefinitely. There has to be some kind of stabilization in that market. Does the clearinghouse do that? I'm skeptical, but maybe it at least puts us on a path to something like that. I'm not sure. But that's probably the thing that's keeping ADs up at night as much as anything else right now. I think revenue sharing has made tons of sense all the way through. How to structure all this, I think that it's been pretty straightforward in the end as people have really kind of dug their hands into it. It is that question of how deep is this hole going to continue to grow in terms of like booster dollars that I have to funnel to these two, ever expanding pots of cash. And will at some point we hit the nuclear scenario where I have to start cutting sports to afford it? And that's kind of, I think, the next big sort of burning question in college athletics.
Yeah, the other interesting thing just about the clearinghouse in general to me is it already seems like there's some chaos in terms of these deals being submitted, and we're not really at like a point of the year where there's a ton of activity going on in terms of guys committing. So it seems like it's something where they really need to get this figured out sooner rather than later, because when the football transfer portal window opens and the basketball transfer portal window opens next spring, um, it needs to be a pretty streamlined, buttoned up process, or you're going to have complete chaos in terms of, because a lot of guys are going to want to know like what deal I can get coming to the school and all that, and so there has to be at least some, I guess, resolution on in terms of what's going to be allowed, what's not going to be allowed. It seems pretty open ended still in terms of how that's all going to work, and like I said, right now is not even really the prime time for player movement, but let's not kid ourselves here. A lot of the player movement around college sports is based on money, and so guys are going to want to know how they're going to be compensated at their new school. So to me, that seems like another kind of unresolved issue with the whole clearing. I mean, the idea of this clearinghouse was good in theory, and then you talk about the first word that people bring up when they hear clearinghouse is lawsuit, right? And then you also have the idea of just figuring out the volume of deals that are going to be flowing into that when we get to the busier points of year. I think it just seems like a very much a work in progress in a system that we could be sitting here a year or two from now and talking about how it was this big failed experiment and how it didn't work out. I could be wrong, but it to me just seems like a system that may not be sustainable for the long term.
Because there also are just like, I mean, I've heard rumors of schools exploring workarounds. Like, what if you convert? I think the way it was explained to me, and I think it was some of our friends down south that were floating ideas like this, because where I'm from, rules exist to be worked around wherever possible in college athletics, particularly college football. And I think the way it was explained to me is like, what if you convert a collective into a marketing agency and then hire an athlete on as talent, which is kind of how, that works for a lot of people at the professional level. You sign on with like creative artists or something like that, and then they go represent they go negotiate as your representation, commercial deals, and essentially what in effect they are doing is representing you as talent that some sort of business would want to hire, or if you want to think about it a different way, and these aren't perfect comparisons by any means, but the way that like a movie studio would hire a popular actor or actress, they would go to their agency and say, we want this talent in this movie, we think that's what's going to make it really sing at the box office. What do we have to do? What will it take? How do we make that match? Well, if you turn a collective into a marketing agency, and again, you sign athletes as talent, then those aren't NIL deals. Those are business arrangements. And I don't see how the NCAA comes close to governing that. And, you certainly can't tell a marketing agency what a player is allowed to be paid or not paid, like that, I don't know if that is possible in the end, but the point is there are so many. This is why I say whatever seems like common knowledge now, or conventional wisdom or best practice, just like NIL, we're going to look back in 12 months. We're going to be like, why did we ever think that was the right thing to do? Boy, did we look stupid, because it's going to keep evolving that way for at least the next probably 24 to 36 months. And, maybe this pushes us to full employment status and collective bargaining. I don't know. It probably further fractures the college athletics landscape, just by its very nature. But it's going to be between entities or individuals that challenge some of these rules and then ones that just try to create workarounds. It's going to be, you know,
I mean, do
it's,
you think that's where we're headed? Is the whole employment piece? Is that
I mean, I my argument would be that it will come with a lot of headache for 12 to 24 months because the scale of it is incredibly difficult. It's not like it is not apples to apples with like the NFLPA or the NBA Players Association because the needs of a Big Ten football player are different vertically than the needs of a Colonial Athletic Association football player, and they're also different horizontally to the needs of a Big Ten volleyball player.
right?
So how do you create the structure that allows all these people to be treated as employees while also recognizing that they need to be able to organize and bargain collectively, but in different ways and for different things? And I think that probably a lot of people would have to wear that on the chin, and some people would probably wind up looking silly, and some would probably lose their jobs. But I think that when we get to the other side, the very bad metaphor that I have reached for is it's like when your car's breaking down and you can pay $5,000 to get it fixed fully and it'll run like new and everything will be fine. Or the mechanic keeps telling you they can do patch jobs for $700 or $800, and you don't want to go for the full 5,000, but you're just going to keep pouring money into a car that's going to keep breaking down, and eventually you'll probably have to pay the big price anyway. I think that's a little bit where it feels like college athletics is. We have 200 years of labor law in this country that can guide us in terms of how to structure athletes as employees, and then we can collectively bargain things like multi-year contracts with buyouts, medical care, insurance. We can collectively bargain things as basic as like when portal windows will be open, what athletes are allowed to do and not to do when they move between schools, unlimited transfer exceptions or maybe one-time transfer exceptions. These are all things that you can collectively bargain. You can say, well, if we give you this, then you need to give us that. All politics are short term, so nobody wants to wear it on the chin, and that's why I think we're going to keep seeing these sort of incremental steps toward something like that. And I think in the end, we're probably going to wind up there anyway. The one philosophical difficulty I struggle to kind of reconcile in that future is that one of the few legal arguments the NCAA has actually had some success with in the last few years, and one that I do, even as someone who is kind of skeptical of a lot of the old arguments the NCAA makes in these cases, this is when I do have some time for, is that college athletics can't become just a fully professional model because nobody watches minor league sports. That is essentially kind of been the NCAA's argument in a couple of cases, and it's not totally unfair if you turn college athletics into, if in the eyes of consumers, viewers, fans, students, alumni, etc., you basically just turn college athletics into a less skilled version of professional sports, it loses its appeal. Everyone knows when they tune in to Ohio State, Penn State on a Saturday night in October that they are not watching a game that will be played, maybe even coached, as well as, Jaguars Colts the next day, because the NFL is just going to have better players and it's probably going to have better coaches and things are going to be more advanced and more refined and polished. A big part of what gives college athletics its appeal is the idea that it's something different and that that athletes are amateurs and that there is this tangible connection to your alma mater or to the school that culturally represents where you're from or whatever. Like that is a big part of college sports underlying appeal. And if you take that away, then you do run the risk of college sports just becoming something a lot less sort of marketable and appealing and therefore successful. I mean, like, you think about the academy system in European sports, you know, playing sports for your university is not a thing there. Like there are some small like some very isolated examples like Cambridge and Oxford rowing, but like nobody wants to watch Cambridge and Oxford. I assume they both have like soccer teams in some form. Nobody watches that. It's all professional.
Right.
That's kind of a philosophical, and I rambled on a tangent here, but it is, I think, the one, sort of specter looming over this conversation that is less technical, is less details and dollars and cents, and why don't we just sit down and hash this out and make it work, and a little bit more philosophical. How do we move college athletics to a place where all this stuff is better controlled and fairer and more even, and without either just basically burning college athletics out from the inside by cutting all the sports. Because if college athletics behaved purely like a business, it would run two sports, because only two sports make money. How do we not allow that to happen, but also retain, as we move towards some sort of employment model, the amateuristic, the amateur characteristics that do set historically college sports apart from professional sports? I don't know the answer to that, and that's a question that I think is difficult to wrangle with.
A few other things I want to get your take on, just in terms of, I mentioned earlier the commitment of Restitch for next season's roster. What did you make of that addition for next season? Does it seem like he's going to be more of a long term development piece, someone that could come in next season and make an impact? Really hard to tell, based on the fact that none of us have ever seen him play in person. There's probably 4 or 5 minutes of video out there that we can watch in terms of seeing him playing some, excuse me, some of the FIBA overseas events. But I thought it was an interesting pickup. Kind of came out of nowhere, but looks like a player that long term fits with what Indiana and Darren DeVries are trying to do, just in terms of his makeup as a shooter and someone a little bit older, obviously going to be coming into college. I think a little bit older than your average freshman, has played some professional basketball, and Serbian basketball, obviously strong, known for producing some really high level players. So it seemed like a savvy addition, and someone that could maybe not step in right away and play a ton of minutes, but someone long term that could maybe develop into a contributor down the line for the program.
Yeah, what's Steph Kreshnik's excuse? Where's his basketball ability? I mean, I'm still waiting for him to show his hoop. I mean, I'm fascinated by just the expansion of like college recruiting into Europe, which has exploded in the last year. I think my assumption would be primarily because these kids can make money now. That
Right.
basically, before you could play professionally over there, and I don't think people realize like quite how robust basketball leagues are over there. There are thousands of basketball players in Europe across all the different leagues in Serbia, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany. I mean, like I think Al Durham played in Scotland for a while. Like it's. I mean, there is so much basketball being played in Europe. Obviously, not always at the college level. And I think what appeals to kids who come over from Europe about playing in college is it probably gives them more direct access to NBA scouts, both because scouts, there's just a greater scouting apparatus around college games than there is European games for the NBA, and also because that allows them, I think, to compete more directly with the other players scouts are evaluating, rather than the sort of the question of our good friend Fran Fraschilla, can Fran give us some sense of what this player's like? Fran, for those who don't know, Fran knows the European game very well. But you don't necessarily need that if Alexa Ristic has played 2 years in the Big Ten, and you know what he looks like against. I'm just pulling players from the recent past. Terrence Shannon, you know what he looks like against Io DeSumo or against Braden Smith or whoever, and so you have a better frame of reference. But the flip side was, I think a lot of these kids didn't want to come over because they could make money playing over there, and because I think in a lot of these cases, and I don't know as much about basketball as I do soccer, but I know that the structure is somewhat similar. In a lot of these cases, these teams would still help pay for their education. The flip side is, and this is not, I'm not trying to sound like, American exceptionalism, sort of cheerleader. American universities, particularly like Big Ten universities, would be considered among the best in Europe. Research universities with so many different degree opportunities and things like that, like an IU degree, an Illinois degree, a Michigan degree. That is, the schools that we're talking about that sometimes we say, oh, Indiana's top 30, but Michigan's top 15, like they both be, top 100 internationally. And so the educational opportunity is great. The NBA access or NBA, exposure opportunity is substantial. Now they can come make money playing college. And I don't fully understand the mechanisms in revenue sharing because like there was all the stuff around if you're here on a certain visas, you can't make money off NIL. I mean, too many of these kids are coming over for me to think that they're all just like being sold a wing and being sold on a dream. So I think again, the presumption is these kids can now make money playing in America the same way they could playing back home, and they get greater exposure to the professional level. They get a really high class education, and I am just fascinated in general to see how this unfolds because I think you've already seen, obviously, there have been the jokes about, just how sort of Europe bending Illinois' roster is going to be. Of course, last year, Kasparas Yakachonis was kind of a revelation for the Illini. He's now, for the record, a wonderful second line point guard for the Atlanta Hawks in one of my NBA 2K sims. It's remarkable how easily he gets to the rim. But this does feel a little bit like one of those sort of things that if you don't have a plan for the next like 3 to 5 years for recruiting in Europe, then you are already behind the 8 ball. And I mean, Indiana, kicked the tires on some other European recruits and I think wound up maybe passing on a couple of opportunities because they already had guys in other positions. But, I think whether one individual player is successful or not, it does feel like this is kind of a widening recruiting pipeline that you as a high major college basketball program need to be prepared for this. You can't just be one of those like, oh, if we have an assistant that knows the European game a little bit, we'll go over there every once in a while for a player. I would not be shocked if in 5 years, every Big Ten roster's got at least one European-born player on it, and I think that's at least I suspect a future that programs and coaching staffs with a plan for how to attack this new talent pool, this newly available talent pool, are going to be the ones that benefit from it the most.
Last thing, and it's a story that I keep hoping will go away, but I keep seeing updates periodically on my various social media accounts. NCAA tournament expansion. Where are you at on this? Is it I didn't like the move to 68 to be honest with you, but it seems like there was probably people back in the day whenever the tournament expanded to 64 didn't like it, and now we're talking about adding more teams. It seems almost inevitable based on maybe some of the reasons you talked about earlier, the money aspect of it, the more inventory that they can give for this flagship event for college basketball, the more money is going to eventually end up in the hands of the schools. So I understand it from that standpoint, but every year we go through a tournament selection process where we look at these schools that barely miss a tournament and say, X, Y, and Z school didn't necessarily deserve to make it, and now we're talking about adding even more teams to the fray. Is this just inevitable for college basketball that the expansion is going to happen? It seems like it's being slow played a little bit, but just based on the tone and some of the things that I've read, and uh, it seems like it's maybe not this year, but if in future years, it's something that it's certainly going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm doing some googling, and I can't find an answer to how many Division One teams there were in college basketball in 1986, which was I think 85 the first year that they expanded to 64 teams. It was either 85 or 86.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
so
somewhere around there.
yeah, so I certainly don't think there were 364 or anything approaching that.
I think we're
Uh,
365 now.
well, the thing is that I think you are going to see a number of schools that drop Division One sports and go back to like Division Three or even like an NAIA level because they just don't. They know they're not going to be able to compete financially, and so
Right.
they are just trying to pull back to something that looks more like what it was 30, 40 years ago. And I think that's going to be down at the bottom. I mean, that's going to be like schools in like the MAAC or like the NEC that are going to contract in that way, or not contract, but just like level down, basically, and not try to compete at a level they're not going to be able to afford. But the point is, the last time we meaningfully expanded the NCAA tournament, and I understand we went from 64 to 68 a few years, like probably about 20 years ago, but like the last time we went to a bigger round number, um, I wish I could find this, but I'm guessing it was a lot fewer than 350, 360 Division One programs. And the argument for expanding the tournament, which is, very often made by coaches who I think want it to be easier for them to keep their jobs, is not completely, it's not totally unfair. I remember Bo Ryan making this argument years ago that, you know, because of the bowl system, more than half of college football gets access to the postseason at the Division One level. But with basketball, because there are so many more teams, it's only a fraction. It's like 20%. It's like maybe not even that. If what I don't know what 68 times 5 is, it's probably right around there. It's probably right around 20% as opposed to 55, 58%, in football. And I don't, Bo wasn't suggesting we expand to 164 teams. He was just saying, and honestly, like when I think now, even just as I'm speaking out loud, when I think now about NCAA tournament expansion and how long these different entities have been lobbying for it, I'm kind of surprised it hasn't happened already, to be honest with you. It is not something consumers are asking for. I do think, my good friend Greg Doyle, our columnist, wrote a column where he basically said, I bet you'll still watch. And he's right. We all will. That's not necessarily, a reason for this. Listen, it just because the consumer will consume doesn't mean that something needs to be done. But while I don't like the idea of expansion, and in general, I think it will start to water down meaningfully and to its detriment the popularity of the NCAA tournament, in the same way that we're probably heading for a negative return in football somewhere in the not terribly distant future. I do kind of understand some of the arguments for it. It does feel like an answer searching for a problem, if you know what I'm saying. But as you said, it's what it really is it's money, it's inventory. It creates more NCAA tournament games, which again, people will watch, which means that Turner or somebody else, when the contract runs up in 2032 or whatever it is, 2031, whatever it is, will pay more money to the schools. Of course, more of that will go to the power conferences. Yes, it might create some access, for smaller schools. I've seen some small school conference commissioners express support for it. I'm sure there will be a little bit of expanded access for small schools, but it's gonna favor the major conferences. We all know that. It's a little bit like England enacting the Magna Carta and then pretending that those rights barely existed for 400 years. It's not. It's. I would be shocked if it's much more than like a token gesture. again, like on the one hand, it does feel inevitable. On the other hand, and I say this just from a completely neutral, sort of position. On the other hand, I'm kind of surprised it hasn't happened already because prominent figures in the sport have been pushing for it for 10 years, 15 years, and some of their arguments are valid. Number one, if there's more money to be made, what's the worst, what's the harm in going to make it? Number two, you are still talking about a postseason that is dramatically more, what is the word? Substantially more selective than its football counterpart. I know people don't care about 6-6 bowl games between a MAC team and a Sun Belt team, but like enough people do, or else that bowl game wouldn't exist.
Right.
I don't like it, and I don't just. It all fits on the same sort of self-destructive track. It feels like college football has set itself on here for a while, but on the other hand, what I will say is I do understand kind of some of the arguments for it, even if I don't necessarily agree with all of them. And more than anything else, as I said a minute ago, I'm mostly just surprised it hasn't happened yet because it seems like we do this every 2 or 3 years and it always seems inevitable because it always seems like, well, this is all just driven by money and opportunity and the big conferences want more. So we got to give them more or else. And then, I mean, I think ESPN reported yesterday that the Division I basketball committee basically came away without a consensus decision on what to do about expansion. So I mean, it's I keep assuming it's going to happen at some point. I don't necessarily think it's going to be great for the sport. I also don't think it's going to be cataclysmic for the sport either. I think 4 years down the line, whatever number they settle on, 76 or 78 or whatever, we'll just be like, well, yeah, that's the size of the tournament. Why wouldn't that be how many teams make it?
Right.
Um, and then we'll start talking about expanding to 96 or 128, and we will just restart the dance because that's what we do, I guess.
I've kind of accepted the fact that it's coming, but still like to complain until it's actually announced. Maybe it's one of those things that they're going to just slide into the news cycle on a Saturday, 3 or 4 weeks into college football season, and hope that it doesn't grab as many headlines as it would right now. So we'll see how it all goes down. Zach, stay cool going out there to cut your grass. I know we've got the Puerto Rico trip's about a month away coming up for IU. I
Yeah.
know you're going down there.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be an interesting experience to get a chance to watch this new Indiana team. So looking forward to reading your observations for that. But thanks for carving out the time for us on this Friday in July.
No, thanks for inviting me. It's always a joy to be on podcast on the Brink. Everyone should listen and subscribe. Probably should have said the top of the show, but if they made it
Yeah,
this far, they already subscribed. But
that's
we
right,
are
for sure. Yeah, as Zach said, if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating over on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.